Yeah, hi, I'm Adam. I'm technical consultant at OpenAthens. I've been here a while, so I am fortunate enough to work with kind of both sides of the coin in terms of the identity provider or library type organization, as well as the service provider or publisher type organization. Scope of today's call is not a big old thing about privacy or anything. I'm narrowing this to obviously the context why we're all here. OpenAthens and federated access, limiting it to sort of personalization and privacy within discovery services, book vendors, accreditation sites, journal papers, and video content, et cetera, et cetera. So first, what do I mean by personalization? So for this, I'm kind of talking about saved searches, bookshelves, CPD or CME accreditation type things, to-do lists, reading lists, watch later, read later type things, reminders and notifications, favoriting certain articles, journals, whatever. So that's just obviously some examples of personalization, but I'm sure there are many other forms of personalization, but these are the ones I'm kind of focusing on. And then privacy, what do we mean by that? So this is the right that someone has, that everyone has, to keep their personal life or personal information secret or known only to a small group of people or a trusted community, that kind of thing. So how do I keep my personal information private? The honest answer is I don't really have a great deal of choice or say in the matter, because generally speaking, me as an individual, I don't necessarily own my data. I don't own my account. Generally, all of that is, and the transfer of my information in this space is decided upon between the service provider and the identity provider. So service provider, hypothetical example, a publisher asks a library to send XYZ information. The library makes a decision to maybe send that. I'm probably not involved in that decision. I don't necessarily know that's happening. So I myself don't have a great deal to say in the matter. So really the question is, how can you keep my personal information private? And specifically, I'm going to focus on PII, or personally identifiable information. So going back to the space we're in, we're talking about federated access. Now, federated access by design is privacy preserving. And we, other national federations, other identity provider and service provider vendors employ, yeah, I think that's the right term, a data minimization kind of ethos. So what I mean by that is release the bare minimum of information to everyone until you are asked for additional information. So that's kind of one thing that OpenAthens and other federated access methods kind of bring to help both you, the library, and you, the service provider, keep my data private, is utilize federated access methods to be privacy preserving and don't supply information that you don't need to, or don't request information you don't need to. So one such, before I move on to that, so as a reminder, things around safe searches, bookshelves, lists, favoriting, well, in order to add something to a bookshelf, to save a search, why do I need to supply personal information for any of that? Because really all I need is a specific profile within a particular application. Notifications, okay. If it was email notifications, clearly I need to provide my email address. But if it's in-app notifications, I don't necessarily need to supply, or I shouldn't need to supply personal information. So one such thing that is employed generally in federated access is the concept of pseudonymization, which is basically the action or practice of giving a person or thing a pseudonym, much like an author would have a pen name, because they don't necessarily want to divulge their personal identification. And this could also be the removal or replacement of identifiable personal details to ensure that those details can't be matched to specific individuals without auxiliary things, additional data that should be held separately. So the point here about pseudonymization is it's not pure anonymization, because there is, for accountability purposes, if you identify misuse, for example, the organization should be able to track down that user to, I don't know, speak to them, to investigate. So it's not pure anonymization, it's just not personally identifying the individual, but still able to identify this is a returning person. For many, many, many years, decades even, the de facto standard attribute was eduperson targeted ID, or this helpfully renamed attribute, the ernoid.10 thing. Now, technically speaking, this has been deprecated, which again, technically means any new service shouldn't really be using it. And the new, in theory, the new de facto standard attribute will be pairwise. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because there's the concept of deprecation, there's the concept of end of life. We're not quite there yet. I'm going to move on. And then there's another pseudonymous attribute, which is called eduperson unique ID. Now, the first two I mentioned, target ID and Pairwise-ID, they are targeted or pairwise. So these are unique to the individual within the organization to which they're trying to sign in from and the service provider that they are contacting. With eduperson unique ID, it is unique for the individual from the institution, but is a shared ID, a globally unique ID that can be sent to multiple service providers. Now, the difference between the two is target ID and pairwise ID generally are the de facto ones that you want to use, because generally speaking, there's not a lot of sharing or tracking cross service provider. So it's a bit more secure is not the right word, but a bit more private. With eduperson unique ID, there are some circumstances where, I don't know, say I log into a publication platform or a library portal, and there's lots of widgets pulling information from other service providers. Maybe about holds or books that have been checked out. So you might need a shared identifier to contact and retrieve information from elsewhere. So going back to the point of how can you keep my personal information private, I kind of want to frame it in these three questions. Do you really, so this is a question that a librarian, for example, could ask a service provider, but also what service provider should be thinking. Do you really need to identify me using personal information in order to make use of such personalization features? Or can you uniquely identify users without that PII, personally identifiable information? Would the user experience genuinely suffer if my personal data was not provided to you? So an example of that is, well, if you want to turn on email alerts, clearly you need an email. So whilst we're proponents of data minimization, privacy by design, and all of that kind of stuff, we're not saying never request personal information, because sometimes there is a need. Moving into the OpenAthens side, and I'm aware of time, but moving on to the OpenAthens side, there is a default policy. This isn't that. This is a frame of what, in theory, could be the default for any organization adopting federated access. So one is a unique user ID, such as targeted ID or Pairwise-ID, and scoped affiliation, because generally you need to know the scope of the organization. The reason we generally lead with target ID, I mentioned that it was deprecated. The reality is, though, it's a bit of a chicken and egg type thing. If all of a sudden a administrator of an identity provider product, a single sign-on product, if all of a sudden you said, all right, target ID is deprecated, let's turn it off. Well, all of a sudden, all of your users will then no longer get personalization with whatever systems they're accessing. So working with service providers, if they are making a move to something like Pairwise, generally the recommendation would be for the service provider to consume both, and therefore for the identity providers to release both, so that the new ID, Pairwise, can be effectively update the record to use that where target ID matches. So then there's a way that you wouldn't lose personalization, but you can still manage the transition from target ID to Pairwise without identifying the individual by their first name, last name, email. It can still be done through that pseudonymous ID. Again, unique ID. If there was some resource that you needed to share information with, you can do that. So OpenAthens makes this flexible so that the identity provider can limit the information they're sharing, because there's a global policy, a default policy that is attributes released to everyone, but then you can specifically send specific attributes to specific service providers where relevant. And as I say, yes, we're proponents of data minimization, but that doesn't mean you should never share personal information. If, for example, you were doing single sign-on into your HR system or your payroll system, well, it's likely that you'd probably want personal information in that. So to summarize, because again, I am at time, I would just try and think, whoever you are, whether you're on the identity provider side, the service provider side, question what information is mandatory and what is optional. Question why personally identifiable information is needed, and ensure that any privacy statements or privacy policies are updated to reflect the information used within and without the library. So what information is shared with external parties. And bonus question, I would say, well, how would you feel if you discovered that your information was being shared without your knowledge, or without knowing how that information was being used? So before requesting or before sending personally identifiable information, I would kind of just ask those sort of questions. So thank you very much. I am over, but I think we've got 2 minutes for questions. Which thus far, there are none. Just going into the chat. Ooh. Okay, so what is the difference between pairwise ID and eduperson targeted ID? That's an interesting question. That's sort of like asking what's the difference between first name and last name. And I don't want to be that guy that says, well, they're different because they're different. They are generated different. That's for sure. So there has been a known algorithm for how to generate target IDs, which, if migrating from one system to another, you would be able to maintain personalization with any service provider using target ID, because you could create the same settings so that if you migrate from one single sign-on system to another, it would generate the target ID the same. Pairwise-ID is not quite the same. So there isn't a defined algorithm for how that should be generated. So therefore, migrating from one system to another, you may not be able to maintain personalization on going forward. But they're both targeted, so they're both unique to the individual within the specific organization contacting the specific service provider. So where are the settings that I mentioned, re the IDs, which, just going back, these settings, I believe, is where the question is. So if you go into, I believe, within the admin area, references, attribute release. Here is where you will see the default policy, so the attributes that are currently being released to all service providers, and where then the service provider specific policies can be managed, and they will supersede any default release policy. So whatever is in or not in the service provider specific policy is what will be released to that service provider. And thank you very much for your questions. Thank you for your patience. That was a quick overview. So now I'm going to hand over to Jane.